مشاهدي اي سي سي عربيك، اهلا وسهلا بكم في حلقه جديده من كورس كوركتيف اكسرسايز سبيشاليست والمعتمد من نسم، حلقه رقم 8 الا وهي بعنوان الموفمنت اسسمنت.
لو انت اول مره تتفرج عليا، انا احمد مجاهد اي سي سي اي ترينر، ودي قناه
اي سي سي اي بالعربي.
بنقدم شرح لمناهج الانترناشونال سواء كان الاي سي سي اي او نسم، بلس بعض الفيديوهات التوضيحيه للبيجنرز اللي عايزين يبتدوا الجيم. لو عجبكم موضوع القناه متنسوش تعملوا لايك سبسكرايب شير عشان الكل يستفاد. يلا بينا نبدا الحلقه.
كنا اخدنا الحلقه اللي فاتت الاستاتيك اسسمنت، واللي هو كان في حاله الجسم الثابت بنقدر نعمل تشيك اوت على الفايف كاينيتيك شين اللي احنا خدناهم، ابتداء من الفوت والانكل والني والليمبو بلفيك هيب كومبلكس والشولدر والثوراسيك سباين والهيد والسيرفايكال سباين، وقدرنا نعرف ايه هي الانحرافات اللي موجوده عشان نقدر نعدلها. لكن هنا العلماء قال لك ان جسم الانسان في وضع السكون قد يكون بعض الديفيجن ما تكونش واضحه ليكم قوي، لكن في حاله ان الجسم بدا يتحرك بتبتدي الديفيجن دي تعمل حاجه اسمها اوفر كومبنسيشن. اوفر كومبنسيشن يعني فكره المبدا التعويضي، يعني لما اجي اعمل سكوات على سبيل المثال ابتدي كعبي يترفع، ابتدي ركبتي تخش لجوه، ابتدي يحصل روتيتور للهيب، ابتدي ايديا تنزل، بعض انحرافات كده ممكن تظهر. تعالوا النهارده نتعرف ايه هي الانحرافات في حلقه الموفمنت اسسمنت. بس قبل ما نبدا في الموفمنت اسسمنت لازم نعرف ان احنا هنشتغل على 3 انواع من الحركه. اول حركه اسمها الترانزيشنال اسسمنت، ودي هناخد فيها 4 حركات: الاوفر هيد سكوات كتست كاختبار، والموديفايد اوفر هيد سكوات، والسنجل ليج سكوات، والسبليت سكوات. اما اللودد موفمنت اسسمنت هنا برضو العلماء قال لك ان الحركه لوحدها باستخدام البادي ويت غير كافيه، يعني لو حملناها بوزن ممكن برضو تبقى في حاجات تظهر لنا ما كانتش ظاهره في كديفيجن، يعني في عمليه ان البادي ويت بيعمل التيست زي في حاله الترانزيشنال اسسمنت. فعشان كده هيبقى عندي اللودد موفمنت، وهنا عشان احط لود لازم احط لود في جميع الحركات بتاعتنا: البوش والبول والاوفر هيد بريس، كلها طبعا عباره عن ايه؟ بوش وترانك روتيشن وسكوات وهنج وسبليت ستانس وسنجل ليج اند ستيبنج. وده النوع الثاني من الحركه. النوع الثالث والاخير من الحركه اللي برضه هندرسه وهنقدر نطلع منه في اطار الدايناميك موفمنت كاسسمنت، يعني هيكون اسمه الدايناميك موفمنت اسسمنت. عباره عن ايه الدايناميك موفمنت اسسمنت؟ دي بيبقى متضمن بعض حركات الجسم بيعملها، زي ايه؟ زي ان هو يمشي مثلا، تحليل المشيه بتاعته زي ما احنا شايفين على الشاشه كده. المشيه ليها بدايه وليها نهايه، في ناس بتمشي الكعب بيصطدم الاول، في ناس زي ما هو واضح ده هنشوفه طبعا بالتحليل وبالفهم العميق. وعندي الديبس جامب اسسمنت زي ما هو واضح قدامنا كده على الشاشه، وده برضو نتيجه الحركه دي بيحصل بعض كومبنسيشن ما بتكونش موجوده. والديفيس تيست. يلا مع بعض ناخد اول حاجه الاوفر هيد سكوات اسسمنت. نتفرج على الفيديو ده ونرجع مع بعض نحلل الحركه.
Now let's review one of our transitional movement assessments, the overhead squat assessment. The overhead squat assessment is a fantastic tool for you to be able to get a good impression of your client's movement capabilities. The squat is a fundamental movement pattern that we all have to do. And so as you take them through this assessment, it will give you an idea of how well they're moving at their foot and ankle, their knee, their hip, all the way up into the upper extremity. In terms of value for your client, you don't have to say much to them other than you're going to be doing this assessment to get an idea of what you need to address from a programming perspective. That what you see here is going to help you begin to give them some individualized exercises to help them get to their goals. You don't have to get into that you're looking for muscle imbalances and all these other things. Just keep it very high level with them and let them know that from this, the exercises you're going to give them will be part of the warm-up or movement preparation process that they'll do prior to training with you and prior to doing their other workouts, maybe on their own. So like with all of our other assessments, when you perform the overhead squat assessment with your client, you want to standardize the process for consistency's sake. It also will help you to more accurately identify progress and change over time. So with this particular assessment, client setup is critical. So we want to start with the feet hip to armpit width apart. So we've got Jerry in pretty good position here. We want the shoes off, by the way. It makes it harder to see what's happening at the foot and ankle if the shoes are on. We want the feet, again, hip to armpit width apart. So hip width apart would be directly in line with the ASIS. Armpit width would just be slightly wider than that. We don't necessarily want to use shoulder width as a point of reference because that can be somewhat arbitrary. People may go wider than they should, and that can influence the movement patterns that you see. We also want the client on a surface that's relatively low friction. So if they're on a surface where there's a high degree of friction, it may make it more difficult for the foot and ankle to move naturally, and therefore for you to be able to see any compensations at that joint segment. From there, we want to make sure that the feet are oriented straight ahead. So hip to armpit width apart, and we want the toes pointed at 12 o'clock and the inside edges of the feet parallel to each other. This may not seem natural to your client or comfortable, but again, this standardizes the process. Something that you can do if your client is comfortable with it and consents to it is actually videotape them performing this assessment. Not only will it help you as you try to get more comfortable with this process and identifying compensations, but it also allows you to be able to identify progress and change over time. You can show your client, hey, this is your squat video the first time we met, and then after a month, 6 weeks, 2 months of training and so on, you can redo the assessment, setting everything up the exact same way, and be able to show them how much they've improved and how more fluidly and controlled they move. So once you have the foot set up, everything looks good there. We want to get the arms completely overhead as far as possible. So as far as hand position goes, we can try to keep the blades of the hand, pinky side of the hand facing forward, and we want the arms as up overhead as far as possible on the sagittal plane. It's common for clients to let those arms come out to the side. So to begin, we want them in the sagittal plane as much as we can. From there, what we're gonna do is just instruct the client to squat down. Don't squat yet. And we're gonna look at them from the front and from the sides. We're just gonna look at them from two perspectives. And as they squat down, you want them to move comfortably. They don't have to go super slowly. That could actually affect the compensation patterns that you're looking for. It can influence the things that we're trying to identify here. So just have them move at a comfortable pace. Doesn't have to be too slow, not too fast. And as they squat, we're just gonna start at the bottom and work our way up. So from the front view, we're gonna start at the foot and ankles. Go ahead and squat down for me, Jerry. Go to about the height of a typical chair and then come right back up. So just do some continuous squats up and down, almost like you're doing a warm up with them. And what we wanna look for at the feet is, do the feet stay straight ahead? Go ahead and rest for a moment. You can put your arms down. Do the feet stay straight ahead, parallel to each other, or do they start to deviate laterally? So we can see already with Jerry, as he did a few reps, his feet started to turn out to the side. So whereas when we started, his toes were pointed directly straight ahead at 12 o'clock, as he did a few repetitions, they started to turn outward. Any lateral movement of the foot or lateral deviation of the foot from the starting position, we would classify as a compensation. Doesn't matter how small it is, because this squat task is relatively low intensity. So if we start doing more intense activities with the client, like jumping or running for cardio exercise, for example, what you see here in this low intensity squat task is gonna be magnified. So any lateral movement, you wanna make note of that, okay? So we would call that external rotation at the foot. And with all these compensations that we review, for you to be able to determine what muscles are contributing to that compensation, both from an overactivity and underactivity perspective, refer to the resources directly within the course. So that will help you start to put your programming together. All right, from there, we're gonna move on up to the knees. And we're looking for one compensation primarily at the knee, and that's gonna be, do the knees cave in toward each other into a valgus position? So for this one, we're gonna be looking at the relationship between the kneecap and the big toe. We can also look at the relationship between the knee and the hip as well to see if they're staying nice and aligned or if we're getting that knee valgus or cave-in compensation. All right, so we're gonna get Jerry, arms up overhead. We're gonna pretend that we're just picking up right where we left off. You know, ideally with your client, you're just gonna have them squat continuously while you evaluate all these checkpoints. But for the purposes of the video, we're stopping in between. All right, so he's got his feet nice and straight ahead. We're gonna imagine that he's just continuing to squat. We've already looked at his foot and ankle, and now we're gonna look at his knees. All right, let's go ahead. Very nice. And let's just do a few repetitions. And we can see here that on both sides, he's got that knee valgus or knees collapsing in compensation. And go ahead and rest. So what we want to look at is, again, that relationship between the kneecap and the big toe. If the knee moves inside the big toe, especially, that's going to be something that we want to check off as a compensation, that knee valgus compensation. To what degree, if you see that it's evident and you want to mark it off, even if it's slightly outside of the big toe, that's going to be up to you as the trainer to determine. But for sure, if it goes inside that big toe, that's something that we want to check off. Now, one thing to note here with this knee valgus compensation, it can occur in two ways. The first is if the feet stay relatively straight ahead and parallel and just the knees collapse in toward each other. So you can see that in relation to the big toe, those knees are inside the big toe. The other way that it can happen, it's very common, is you'll see that foot turn out compensation in addition to the knees caving in. So when those feet turn out to the side and those knees stay relatively straight ahead and in line with the hip, they're still inside the big toe. So in relation to the foot, that knee is still going into valgus. So you want to pay attention to that. All right, and go ahead and stand back up. So those are the primary things we're looking for at the knee from the front view. Next, we're going to address the lateral view. So for the purposes of the video, I'm going to have Jerry rotate to his left so we can see his right side of the body. And for consistency's sake, when you're doing this with your clients, try to evaluate them from the same side every time. And again, as you're doing this with them, you could have your client rotate in between views, or if you have the room for it, you can just walk around your client to assess them from the front and the side. And that way they can just continue to squat throughout, doing a total of 10 to 15 repetitions, and you can get the information that you need. So from here, we're gonna be looking at a few different things. We're gonna be looking at what's happening at the pelvis and the low back. We're also gonna be looking at the relationship between his trunk, his torso, and his lower leg. And then we're also gonna be looking at the position of the arm and the shoulder during this pattern, all right? So the first thing we're gonna be looking at is the low back position. So let's get the arms completely overhead. His feet are in a good position, hip to armpit width apart, toes straight ahead. He's got some really good shoulder alignment here. So ideally, this arm, the upper arm, should bisect this lateral midline of his body. Basically, it should be in line with the hip, knee, and head. That would approximate about 180 degrees of shoulder flexion. And so he's doing a really good job here. And what's nice is with this shirt, if you see these wrinkles in his shirt, that kind of represents the fibers of his lat muscle. And then we can also take a look at his low back and pelvic position. So the main thing that we're looking at from the side here is, does his low back arch excessively? And so if we bring the arms back down for a moment, try to get an idea of the neutral position with your client at rest. And then as he raises the arms up overhead all the way, let's see if that position changes. So if he goes from a relatively neutral lumbar spine position to when he raises his arms overhead, we see some excessive arching here where that pelvis tips forward and that lumbar spine extends, then we may just want to check that compensation off on our checklist of low back arches. However, he did a great job controlling that, so we're going to get those arms up overhead. And now as he begins to squat, we're going to look to see if the position of the lumbar spine changes at all throughout the movement. So with your clients, you want to look and see what is the position when they're standing there, and then as they bring the arms overhead and begin to squat, if there's any change in that lumbar position, either before or during the movement, you want to check that off as a compensation. So let's go ahead and have Jerry do a few repetitions here. He's going to squat down, and we can see now as he squats down, there's an increase in that lumbar curvature. So he's going into some hyperextension at the lumbar spine, and we definitely want to make note of that, okay? And good, go ahead and relax for a moment. If there's no change, then you're good to go. You don't have to mark anything. Now what we're gonna do is look at the relationship between his upper body and his lower leg. Ideally in our squat, we want the relationship between those two body segments to be parallel to each other. And that indicates that we've got good weight distribution between the hip, knee, and ankle. So we're gonna get Jerry's arms overhead again, and we'll have him squat down and hold in the bottom position of the squat for a moment. I won't keep him down here too long, but if we were to draw imaginary lines from his hip through his armpit, and those lines were to just continue through space, and then another line from his ankle through his knee, we would want those lines to remain parallel to each other. And we're gonna take the arms out of the equation on this one, right? So don't pay attention to his arms, just look at his trunk and his lower leg. Are they relatively parallel to each other? Go ahead and stand up. Or if you had those lines there, would they bisect at some point? If they would bisect, then that would indicate that he demonstrates the excessive forward lean compensation. So ideally, we want those parallel lines throughout the entire movement from top to bottom, okay? And then the last thing that we're looking for is, do the arms fall forward, yes or no? And this is gonna give us a sense of shoulder mobility, scapular stability, and if we've got some excessive muscle tightness on the front side of the body, as well as in the lat muscle, okay? So we'll get the arms up overhead, and Jerry's got a great range of motion here at the shoulder. Now, one thing you can do is just look at the client right from the start. Can they even get their arms all the way back into this position without compensation? So if you have a client who can't even achieve full shoulder flexion, then you may want to make note of that as arms falling forward. The other thing that you want to make note of from the start is, can they keep their arms in the sagittal plane, or do they have to migrate out more into the frontal plane where the arms are coming down into shoulder adduction? Or do the elbows flex? So can they do all this, keep the elbows fully extended, overhead, and in line with the body? Those are all things that we're looking for. Even if your client can't get there, those are things that we want to work towards with a training program. So once everything is set up, we'll get those arms up overhead one more time for me, please. We're gonna have Jerry continue to squat, and then what we wanna do is just look at the relationship between the arm and the trunk. Does it stay the same, or does it start to change as he continues to complete the movement pattern? So go ahead and come on down, just do a few squats. Good, and just move naturally for me. Don't worry about trying to give me the perfect squat. So Jerry's looking pretty good here. Typically what we might see, let's have you hold just slightly. You don't have to go too low. Just go down into a little squat. What we might see is the client gets to the bottom of the squat. You might see their arms dip forward a bit, okay? And then now you can see in relation to his trunk, his arm is in more of an extended position here at the shoulder rather than keeping it all the way up here in full flexion. You might also see them start to come out to the side, as well as those elbows flex. And all of those things, go ahead and stand back up, all of those things would fall under our arms falling forward compensation, and that we'd want to address with our programming. All right, so that is our overhead squat assessment. We're gonna face the camera. Great job, Jerry. Thanks for being such a team player here. So again, overhead squat assessment, fantastic tool for you to begin the program design process, evaluate change in your client's movement quality and movement capacity over time. And again, will help you develop a warm-up and movement preparation programming for your clients prior to training with you.